Hey everybody, Ryan here at eTrailer. Today on our 2020 Jeep Gladiator, we're going to be taking a look at and showing you how to install the Firestone Coil-Rite air helper springs. Before we put our airbags on, what I like to do is take a few measurements. That way we can have some baseline numbers. That way we can compare those numbers once we have our airbags installed. So what we're going to measure is our factory ride height with our factory suspension and no weight in the bed of our Jeep. So here at the front, if you go from the ground to the edge of our wheel well, it's going to be right at 36 inches. And here at the back, take that same measurement, it's going to be right at 38 inches. So I went ahead and put a pretty good amount of weight in the bed of our Jeep. If I had to guess, I'd say probably about 500 pounds. So what we're going to do now is take those same measurements and see how this weight affected the suspension. Here at the front, from the ground to the edge of the wheel well, a little over 36.5 inches. So the front end of our Jeep actually rose up off the ground more. And here at the back, from the ground to the wheel well, the back of our Gladiator actually dropped down 2 inches. So we're sitting at 36 inches from the ground to the wheel well. So essentially what that means, our Jeep is sitting like this. That's going to affect our ride in a few different ways. It's going to reduce our suspension travel, so the ride is going to be a little more uncomfortable, and it's going to potentially make our suspension components fail prematurely. Since the front is lifting up, our headlights are going to be pointed more up towards the sky and not on the ground where we want them. And since it's also pointing up, our tire pattern, or our wear pattern rather, is going to wear unevenly, reducing the life of our tires. And since our tires don't have full contact pattern on the ground, they're really going to affect not only our braking performance, but also our steering performance. So measurements are one thing, but how it actually drives and performs is another. So what we're going to do is run through the test course and see how it does. So the first thing we're going to do is go over our bumps. We'll kind of get going here and straighten out a little bit. And as we go over these first couple of bumps, right away I can tell that our suspension travel has greatly been reduced. At least that's the way it feels. And honestly, the whole Jeep just kind of feels a little sloppy. In my opinion, I want the suspension to be a little bit tighter and feel like it can handle even just a little bit of weight in the bed. I feel like if you had double that weight, you'd be in big trouble. I feel like the suspension would almost be completely bottomed out and it'd just be really uncomfortable. I mean, even in the steering wheel you can feel it, in the brake pedal you can feel it. Overall, just a setup that I wouldn't be too impressed with. I definitely want an improvement. So now what we're going to do is pick up a little bit of speed and do some evasive maneuvering through our slalom course. And I'm really curious to see how this weight's going to affect us while we're turning, and kind of get a little more aggressive here. And you can really feel that weight kind of throwing us around. We got a lot more body roll, and it just feels like I'm not in as much control as I would like to be. The front end feels loose, and it just takes a little more effort to kind of turn and point us where we want to go. Now that we have our airbags installed, I went ahead and put that same amount of weight in the bed. We can take our measurements again. At the front, go from the ground to the edge of the wheel well. It's going to be right at 36 inches. And here at the back, from the ground to the wheel well, is right at 38 inches. So now it's sitting at that exact factory ride height where it should be, even with all that weight in the bed of the truck. And I only have 27 pounds of air in the bags, so we still have quite a bit more adjustability if we need it. So all of those issues that we would have had without airbags should be resolved. We should regain our steering and braking performance, our ride comfort, and allow our headlights to be pointed straight down at the ground where we want them to be. But with that being said, the proof is in the pudding, so let's go ahead and hop back in the Jeep and run it through our test course again. So we'll first start again by going over our bumps. To kind of gain a little speed and straighten out. Go over these first couple. And almost right away, I can tell a huge improvement. The suspension feels like it has a lot more travel. Doesn't feel like we're getting close to bottoming out like we were. Ride's a lot more comfortable. We're not getting thrown around. Honestly, before I could even hear the buckets that we have in the bed bouncing around, I hear minimal noise back there. So we know our Jeep isn't getting tossed around nearly as much. It even feels like the steering wheel is easier to maintain, and overall the Jeep's just a lot more comfortable and a lot more stout in my opinion. This is how it should feel whenever you have some weight in the bed. So over the bumps I noticed an improvement. Let's go through our slalom and do some evasive maneuvering. So I'll pick up a little bit of speed and kind of start getting a little more aggressive with our turning, and much better, actually, a lot better. I feel like you're in a lot more control. Really don't feel the weight back there at all. I feel like I could do this faster if I needed to and not really have to worry about it. So overall, much needed improvement in my opinion. These Jeeps have forgiving suspensions, which is great for regular driving and off-roading, but not so much for hauling a heavy load or putting stuff in the bed. And since these Gladiators have beds, unlike most Jeeps, that's what you're going to be tempted to do. And with the airbags, since they are adjustable, we're going to be able to make our suspension more firm whenever we are adding weight to the bed, but still be able to maintain that smooth ride whenever we're not, since we can always let the air out of them. So this is what it's going to look like once you have your airbags installed. So they're going to fit inside of the coil spring, and once you fill them up full of air, that's what's going to provide that extra support. They are made from a elastic polyurethane, which is really tough and durable and should last for a really long time. And that's especially important, especially on these Jeeps, since a lot of our Jeep customers take their Jeeps off-roading and really beat them up and put them through the course as far as how rough they are on them and how often they use their vehicle. So just to give you a quick comparison, I have the other airbag option right here. And once you kind of get your hands on these, right away you can tell that the Firestone bag is much thicker and just feels a lot more durable, to be honest. I feel like this one would wear out a lot faster. And as far as the adjustability goes, the Firestone bag is going to be adjustable from 5 all the way up to 70 psi as compared to this one, which maxes out at 35 psi. So the Firestone bag is going to give you a lot more adjustability to fine-tune your ride. These are going to have a load carrying capacity of at least 500 pounds and at most 1,000 pounds. But something I want to point out, these aren't going to actually increase your Jeep's overall weight carrying capacity. And if you're unsure what your Jeep's weight carrying capacity is, you can always check in your owner's manual to find that information, and it's a good idea not to exceed that amount. The bags are going to require a little bit of maintenance. They're going to have a minimum air pressure of at least 5 psi, so that's something you're going to have to check every now and again, especially, for example, on those cold nights and hot days where the air pressure inside of the bag can increase or decrease. Now, to make life a little bit easier, you can use these in conjunction with an air compressor. That way you're able to monitor the pressures and adjust them from the inside of your Jeep. Now, as far as the installation goes, believe it or not, it is really straightforward. More or less, the airbag just slips right into the coil spring. There's really not too much involved and shouldn't take you a whole lot of time. Speaking of which, let's go ahead and do that together now. To begin our install, we're going to be working underneath the back of our Jeep. And what I've done is just temporarily lowered and removed the spare tire to give us some more room to work. And once we have that out of the way, you don't have to do this, but it does give us quite a bit more room. What we're going to do is temporarily remove this heat shield. So this heat shield, it's going to be held in place with two 10mm bolts right here and here. And then there's going to be 3 10mm bolts along this back edge. So we'll go ahead and pull those out and lower our shield. Now what we're going to do is lift the back end of our Jeep up, and what that's going to do is actually kind of extend our coil springs and make the gap bigger, and that'll make it easier to get our airbags inside. Since I'm using a drive-on lift, I'm just going to use a pole jack to lift it up. But for those of you at home that just have your jack stands and your regular floor jack, what you're going to need to do is jack your Jeep up by the frame high enough to where your wheels will be off the ground hanging freely. Now we're going to grab our airbag. We're going to take the little valve cap off the top of it. And if we grab the valve cap that comes included with this valve core puller on the end, what we're going to do is take that end and we're going to take the valve core out inside. We'll put that in there, turn it, and then we'll work that core out. So what we're going to do is put some pressure on this bag to get all the air out to make it as small as we can. I find it easiest to kind of do it on the floor. Kind of use your knee. Just really try to push all of that air out. While we're holding it down, we're going to take the plastic valve cap, thread that back on nice and tight. That way air can't enter the bag and fill it back up. With our bag all shrunk, we can now push it inside of our coil spring. Now I find it easier, instead of going into the very top coil, if you start with this coil, there's a little more room. Get the bottom worked all the way down, and then we can kind of push the top of our bag into the spring. Kind of pinch it, and just work it down. A lot of times it just don't slide right in. You're going to have to kind of mess with it and find that sweet spot to get it to go in. So once we get it in, you can reach up and we're just going to take our plastic valve cap off. The bag will kind of fill back up with air and fill up that coil spring. We're going to grab our upper spring support. That's the one that'll be round and have a hole in the center. This is going to slide in place or inside of the coil spring and sit on top of our airbag. The hole is there for our airline tubing to come through and connect to the fitting on our bag. We want the portion that is smaller to face up. Pretty straightforward. It just slides right in and sits on top of the bag. Now whenever we get our lower support in, we are going to have a gap, and that's okay. Once we lower our Jeep back down, it'll take up that gap and sit a little bit tighter. And this is our lower support, very similar to the top one, except one part's going to have a little raised portion here. It's going to sit down like this, so the flat part of the support is again going to face up. Lift our spring up, and that little raised portion is actually going to kind of fit inside of this little cup here. It is offset too, and so what I find, the thicker portion here, that's going to face towards the outside of our Jeep. So kind of just push that down, just like that. So now we can take our air hose, and what I've done is just pulled it all the way out and cut it in half. So this half, what we're going to do is take this brass portion here, and this is actually going to thread onto the air fitting on top of our airbag. So we'll go ahead and work that into the coil spring from the top. And there, and you want this brass portion to go through the hole in our upper support. So we'll pass that through, and once we have it passed through, we can thread it onto our airbag. And like I mentioned, this is how our air line was routed through that hole in our upper support and threaded onto the top of our airbag. I found it a little easier to get it threaded on. I just took a little piece of plastic and just kind of laid it on our coil spring, and that kept our upper support up out of the way to give our hands a little bit of room. But once you have it threaded on, you just pull that out, and that's how that support's going to sit, right on top of the airbag. So before we route our line, we need to choose a location for our no drill bracket, and this is where our inflation valves are going to go to actually fill their bags up full of air. So I'm going to go on our factory hitch, just in this little section here. It's out of the way, but still easy to get to. So the way this works is you just get the large zip ties that come included, run them through the bracket, and you'll just zip tie it up in place. So back to the airline, you're going to grab one of the thermal sleeves, put that onto the airline, and I'm going to push that as far as I can back to the airbag. That'll just help keep it protected from where it goes into the coil spring. Then what I'm going to do is run our airline back to our no drill bracket, and I'll show you the path that I took to get there. So here's how I routed our air tubing. Come out of the airbag, brought it towards the back, just on top of our frame. And I just secured it along the way using some zip ties. Now you want to do your best to avoid any hot or moving parts. And when I got to here, I dropped it down. And what we can do now is cut it to length, get our fitting hooked up, and mount it to our no drill bracket. Whenever we cut our air tubing, you want to be sure to use a tool like this, a sharp utility knife, or we even offer nylon air tubing cutters here at etrailer. You don't want to use a regular pair of snips because you'll pinch the line and chances of it leaking will definitely be increased. So I'll go ahead and cut this to length. Whenever we cut it, you want to inspect it. And what you're looking for is a nice, straight, clean cut with no burrs or anything like that. That's a good example of the way it should look. So what we're going to do is grab our air fitting, plug that into the line. So these just push together, push all the way, and then just lightly pull back to make sure it's seated. We'll have a little bit of movement in the fitting, but that's normal and to be expected. So we'll grab our fitting and a flat washer. Flat washer on. We'll push this through our no drill bracket where we can move around to the other side and get the rest of our hardware on. Here on the other side, we're going to take another flat washer and the nut. Get this started hand tight. We come back with a couple of wrenches and just snug it down a little bit. Now the other side of our Jeep, the airbag will be installed the exact same way. So you'll just repeat that whole process to get this one in over here. The only difference is how we routed our airline. Here's how I routed mine. Just comes up and over the frame just like the other side. Again, following some factory wiring. And I just kind of ran it along the back of our bumper. And it comes up, kind of through a hole in our hitch, and plugs into our air fitting. What we're going to do now is fill our airbags up to the amount specified in the instructions. That way we can make sure we don't have any leaks. Now that the system is full of air, we're going to take some soapy water and we're going to spray all of our connection points or all of our fittings to check for leaks. What we're looking for is for bubbles to be rapidly and consistently forming. If we see that, that's going to indicate that we have a leak and we need to address it. We're going to do that same thing for the fittings on our bags. Now these can be a little tricky to see, so if you can't really see in there all that great, what you can do is park in a quiet place and you can actually listen too. Usually if it's leaking from the bag, you'll be able to figure it out pretty quickly by hearing it. Now if you do have a leak, what you're going to need to do is pull your air line out of the fitting or unscrew it, for example, on our bag. But the ones that do push in at our inflation valves at the back of our Jeep, you would disconnect that, cut the line again where it's nice and clean, plug it back in, fill the system up back full of air, and check for any leaks again. Since we verified we have no leaks, went ahead and reinstalled our heat shield. And then what we can do is just raise our spare tire back up into position. And that'll finish up our look at and our installation of the Firestone Coil-Rite air helper springs on our 2020 Jeep Gladiator.